Researching Eye Tracking to Assess Community Trust is a research project I worked on with the help of the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. So a little introduction on why we even need to find a way to measure people's trust in public health institutions really comes from the COVID-19 pandemic. So during the pandemic, the American people's trust in public health institutions and officials severely weakened and truly never recovered. Because the US had never faced a pandemic like the coronavirus before, the unprepared responses of our government agencies cost countless extra lives. And as a result, many people lost their trust in these institutions. And so now these public health institutions, especially the CDC, are really looking to regain that public trust after these failed responses. And in order to do so, the CDC really needs a way to measure and gauge the public's trust in their institution and public health guidelines and messaging as a whole. Now you may be thinking, what does eye tracking have to do with any of this? Well, users encounter most misinformation or the things that they wouldn't naturally trust online, like through a computer or electronic device. Now, although the brain processes this information, it's really the eyes that are processing all of this first. Now, this can create some questions like, are there any external body language or body behaviors that are evidence when people are taking in this misinformation? And how can we really truly see trust through unconscious body language, more specifically like eye movement? So eye tracking tools come into play because they can be really helpful in answering these questions, because they really analyze every little movement in your eye, which we can analyze to then see if that has any relation to do with their trust. Now, the 3 eye tracking metrics or variables that are going to be really important in this study are duration interval, number of fixations, and number of saccades. Now, duration interval is just the time spent looking at a stimulus, which is usually in seconds, and then the number of fixations is just the number of times your eye fixates on one part of the stimulus. That could be the title or the text or something like that. While the number of saccades is just the number of times that your eye jumps from one fixation point to the next. So that's just kind of going back and forth and your eye gazing. Now let's get into the methodology of the study. So the components and materials that we used were the Tobii eye tracker, which was just a little device that attached to the bottom of our computer monitor and just tracked your eyes. And then we had about 5 test subjects, and then we had our stimuli, which is pretty much articles that we had our participants look at. Now there were 2 baseline articles that would be the first 2 articles that they would read. And so the test subjects would look at them just in order to kind of give us a baseline of their outcomes, like how quickly their eye moves and things like that. And so one of them was trustworthy and one of them was untrustworthy. And then we would show them 6 examples of unknown stimuli. And 3 would be trustworthy and 3 would be untrustworthy. However, we would not disclose which were which. The real trustworthy stimuli were found on the internet, and these articles and tweets consisted of topics surrounding COVID-19 and then the vaccine. And then the fake untrustworthy stimuli was fabricated using ChatGPT and do not actually exist. And the information within these stimuli are false and are not scientifically correct, but they're meant to look and read as if they are real, to kind of simulate if a participant was in the real world and going through articles, to kind of simulate the environment that they would be in, looking at like kind of misinformation. Now for the procedure, step 1 is eye calibration. So first, each participant would calibrate their eyes with the Tobii eye tracker. Second step is to review the baseline stimuli. Each participant would review the first 2 baseline stimuli, and the facilitator would disclose whether they were trustworthy or untrustworthy before they would review it. Step number 3 is unknown stimuli. So then the participant would review a random combination of 4 out of the 6 stimuli, and the credibility of each stimuli would not be disclosed beforehand. Now, the fourth step is verbalization of indicators. So, while reviewing each unknown stimuli, the participant would verbalize any indicators or giveaways of trustworthy or untrustworthy information, or credible or uncredible. Number 5 is categorization. So after the participant reviews each of the stimuli, they would categorize each as trustworthy or untrustworthy. And now the 6th step is analysis. So using Toby Lab and the visualizations that the Toby Lab provides, me and my team would analyze the data in order to find the differences between the eye movement of the participants when looking at trustworthy versus untrustworthy information, and the participants' answers themselves and their guesses on whether that stimuli is trustworthy or untrustworthy. Now for the results. These are some really pretty heat maps that the Toby Eye Lab kind of provides for us, and it just shows where the participant's eye spends the most time on a certain stimuli, which are those articles that they were looking at. And so in the red zones, you can see they spend a lot more time than they would in the green zones. And although they're really pretty to look at, they're not super helpful in terms of our analysis, but they do kind of just give a good sense of what points of interest were really captivating to the eye. So we can see that the trustworthy articles, or people reading the trustworthy articles, spent a little bit more time, were able to have a little bit more number of fixations and a little bit more number of saccades, despite when they were looking at untrustworthy stimuli. Now, all of the metrics, duration, fixations, and saccades were all relatively directly proportional, and that's probably due to the fact that when duration is longer, it allows more opportunities for the eye to fixate and saccade because there's just more time. Now, this next graph pretty much cross-references what a participant perceived to be trustworthy versus untrustworthy versus that stimulus's actual trustworthiness, whether that information was misinformation or it was truly credible. And so T in this case stands for the participant perceived at the stimulus as trustworthy, U being they perceived it as untrustworthy, C being the actual stimulus was credible information, and F being it was fake information truly and it was actually misinformation. So if we see that TF, which means that the participant perceived it as trustworthy, but it was in fact actually fake information, uncredible misinformation, seemed to have pretty much high in every single metric, had a longer duration, which means more contemplating, which also kind of maybe means more confusion. So this makes actually a lot of sense because the participant got the stimulus wrong. And using this could provide commentary on how trusting something that you're kind of uncertain about takes longer because it is innately harder to trust something. Now, our lowest average is when a person perceived it as untrustworthy and it truly was false misinformation. They had the shorter duration, lowest amount of fixations, lowest amount of saccades. And that means less contemplating for the participant and means more certainty. And this makes sense because they got the stimulus correct. And this could also provide commentary on how skepticism allows people to make decisions a lot quicker. And so duration in trustworthy and credible is lower than untrustworthy and credible, and then fixation saccade is of untrustworthy and credible is lower than trustworthy and credible. So just some numbers to look at. Now, although this study was quite successful and we learned a lot, there was still some pretty big limitations, like our small subject pool. Now, 5 participants is definitely not enough to be able to make good, solid conclusions. So we really ran into challenges with biased samples and overestimation of the effects, and in turn, reduced generalizability. Another issue we ran into was just the lack of time. Our analysis was not as thorough or complete as we would have wanted it to be just because of time constraints. And in turn, we were unable to kind of explore all the eye metrics that Toby has to offer, like pupil dilation and things like that. And our final issue that we ran into actually was a calibration issue. And so for one of our participants, only their right eye was calibrated. Now we don't really know exactly how this affected our data, if one eye was more active than the other or something like that, but definitely wouldn't have been good for the continuity of the study. But overall, it was truly an incredible experience, and these limitations are just leading us to our next steps to kind of improve and get a more precise and accurate main study.